Okay guys, welcome back. This is Unit 9 on plants, and we're going to be covering plant reproduction on this podcast. It's going to be broken into flower structure, pollination, fruit development, and seed dispersal.
Alright, flowers are actually the reproductive organs of plants.
And the basic structures of the flower that we're going to go over, it's going to be kind of broken down into the male and the female parts, because the male and the female parts of a plant are included in the same flower. So we have the male part over here, which is broken into two segments. The male part is called the stamen, and it's broken up into the anther, which is where the actual pollen grains are produced, and the filament, that's more of a transport part of it. The female reproductive portion of the flower is called the carpel, and it's actually broken down into three parts. This top part here is the stigma that goes down into this tube called the style, which then attaches into the ovary. The ovules, just like in humans, are kept in the ovary of the flower. You then have a couple other parts of the flower itself down here: the receptacle, the peduncle, the sepal or sepal, and the flower petal, which obviously you're familiar with.
Alright, just a little quiz on flower structure. What is the name of the structure labeled X in this diagram?
Okay, so if you recognize from what we just looked at, that would be the male reproductive part. So that would be the stamen.
Okay, where's the pollen made?
Like I said, the stamen is broken into two parts, the anther and the filament, and the pollen is produced in the anther.
Okay, and where is the ovule found in the flower?
And the ovule, again, that would be found in the ovaries.
Okay, which parts of the flower are labeled below? You can see there's an X and a Y part.
Okay, so this is the female part of the flower, so that would be the stigma is the top part, and the style is the tube.
Okay, pollination. We're moving on here. This is the pollen grain contains the male sex cell, which is a gamete.
Alright, so here we have a little animation of what pollination looks like. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Okay, remember, this can be happening either in the same flower, like in one flower itself, or it can be happening from one flower to another. So it's going to look like this. The pollen is going to come from the anther and go over to the stigma of another flower in this animation. This is an example of cross-pollination, as the pollen travels from one flower to a different flower. This is desirable in plants as it promotes variation.
Okay, pollen can be carried between flowers by insects or by wind. I believe you learned a little bit on this about transport in our last podcast.
Okay, so there's a couple different ways that pollination can occur. It can be insect-pollinated, which those flowers that are reliant on insect pollination are adapted to attract insects to them to enable transfer of pollen. Okay, so we see over here that there's a couple different elements to that. The nectar that is in the plant, or in the flower, I'm sorry, is attractive to the insects. There's also a scent normally that is attractive to the insects. They're also sticky in these particular flowers. The sticky stigma collects the pollen as well. And then the pollen has barbs that hook onto the fur of the insect. The anthers are positioned on the outside of the flower to rub onto the insects, their pollen. And also the brightly colored petals attract insects as well.
Okay, wind-pollinated flowers are different in structure because they do have to attract these insects to them, but they do need to be exposed to the wind. So you can see here these more feathery-like structures. This is the stigma, which it's able to catch the pollen as it's carried by the wind. Now there's no scent or nectary substance in these, but petals are small and green, as there is no need to attract insects. Pollen grains are very small and light, and they occur in large numbers. And you can see the anthers here are exposed to the wind so that the pollen can easily be blown away.
Okay, so remember I was saying that plants can either self-pollinate or they can pollinate one flower to another. So self-pollination occurs when pollen falls from the anther onto the stigma of the same flower. So it's going to look a little bit like this. There's the anther from the male part, and then it goes into the stigma of the female part. Now, self-pollination is not necessarily desirable as it reduces variation, genetic variation.
Flowers will prevent self-pollination by either having stigma above the stamen or having the stamen and stigma mature at different times.
All right, little pollination quiz. Pollination is the transfer from
the anther to the stigma.
Okay, there's two mechanisms for pollination. What are they?
Insect and wind.
Cross-pollination does what?
It increases the variation. Remember, self-pollination would decrease variation.
Flowers are adapted for wind pollination by what?
They have the feathery stigmas.
Okay, so then fertilization and fruit development, you wonder what they have to do with each other. Well, this is what they have to do with each other. Once pollination occurs, a tube grows from the pollen grain down through the style to the ovule. So remember, the carpel is the female part, okay? It has the stigma on top, style is what it travels down. The ovary then contains the ovule. You'll note that the petals aren't shown in this to simplify the diagram. So this is what a regular flower looks like. They've just taken the petals off to show just the female part of it. So there goes the pollen grain. It's going to go into the stigma, down the style, and then into the ovary. All right, fertilization occurs when the male gamete then fuses with the ovule that is in the ovary. So remember, the pollen is the male gamete, and then the ovule is the female gamete. So it's just like in human reproduction as well. Once the male gamete fuses with that ovule, then fertilization officially has occurred. So there it goes, and there's fertilization.
All right, guys, moving on to seed dispersal.
Okay, so after the fertilization occurs of the petals, the stamen and the sepals fall off, the ovule turns into a seed, the fertilized egg inside develops into an embryo plant, okay? So this is just showing you kind of parts of this. The tough seed coat on the outside is called the testa. You have a hole that was made by the pollen tube called the micropyle. Over here, it's showing you, because this is our embryo plant right here, the baby plant. It's got two parts, the plumule and the radicle. It's just the embryo shoot and the embryo root. Okay, shoot on top, root on the bottom. And then this is called the cotyledon, basically this space for food storage. You've probably already gone over a little bit on how flowers are either monocots or dicots. That comes from this word cotyledon. Okay, so monocots have one cotyledon, dicots have two cotyledons.
Okay, water leaves the seed. It dehydrates and becomes dormant because the metabolic reactions stop. Now the ovary develops to become a fruit. Okay, so you can see in this apple here you have seeds. This fleshy wall of the ovary, yes, you are eating an adapted ovary when you crunch into an apple. Who would have thought?
All right, so seeds need to be dispersed away from the parent plant in order to reduce competition for space, light, nutrients, and water. Okay, so there's 4 different ways that seeds can be dispersed. They can be dispersed by the wind, by water, by mechanical means, or by animals.
All right, so here's a little seed dispersal quiz. All right, you can see in this picture below, this is actually a maple key or a dandelion seed. These actually are transported by wind.
Okay, these little guys are actually considered, just as a little nickname, they're considered hitchhikers because these are the ones that will stick to animals' fur, and that's how they're transported. This one is an example of mechanical dispersal. These, when they dry up, they actually open up or burst open, and the seeds are dispelled that way. So this would be mechanical.
Okay, in this picture here you can see your normal berries that you would pick off of a bush. Okay, these are actually also dispersed by animals. Animals eat them and then obviously dispose of their waste, and that's how these seeds are dispersed.
Okay, so the last thing we're going to discuss real briefly is germination. Germination is basically like the development or the production of the seed from the pollen grain. Okay, so when a pollen grain reaches the stigma, It generates into a pollen tube and then eventually forms a seed. Germination is the term for that production. All right, guys, so take notes, write down any questions that you might have, and we'll see you in class.